We're going to be using this HTML for the rest of the CSS examples. So I'm just going to briefly go over it. We have a nav element with a nav class on it, with a div inside of it, with an li inside of it, ul, then li, then an a, which has a href pointing to home and a class of item. So I'm going to be asking you which color the home text will be. In these two examples, we have a nav element and an item class saying the color is going to be blue. And we have a nav element, div element, ul element, li element, and a element, and the color is going to be red. So hands up if you think the color is going to be blue. Hands up if you think the color is going to be red. Great. Next one, there's only 3 of these, so this is the second one. Don't be too scared. We have a nav, ul, and then an item class, again, color blue, and then a nav class, ul element, and an a element, color red. Hands up for blue. Great. Hands up for red. Great. Final one, we're almost done. So we have a nav class, ul element, a element with an attribute selector of / href /. That's going to be blue. And then we have a nav element, nav class, ul element, an item class. Hands up for blue. Hands up for red. Great. I'm going to leave you in suspense and not tell you any of the right answers until after we've went over why most of you are wrong. So, first off, to talk about specificity, we need to talk about the cascade. The cascade is a really, really simple thing to front-end developers, but to most people, it's not. I did that same test where I passed this to some of my non-programmer friends and asked them which color would be applied here. Most of them said red. Obviously wrong. Cascade always means that it takes the last rule if it's the same selector importance. So, to know about selector importance, we need to know about the different selector types. We're going to go through all of the different types that there could be. So we have elements. We've seen these. This is where it's just the element as the selector. We have IDs, denoted by the hash and the ID attribute. We have inline styles, where the CSS is directly inside the style attribute. We have class selectors, which are in the class attribute, denoted with a dot. And we have attribute selectors, which are denoted by the square brackets. When you have an attribute on your HTML element, you can also select that attribute directly. As we've seen in one of the examples, you can actually specify what that attribute is equals to. We have pseudo classes, different to pseudo elements. That is a very important distinction, which you're going to need to know for later. Pseudo classes are things like last child, first child, nth of type, that sort of thing. Something where you're selecting an element that already exists, not where you're creating something new. If you're creating something new, that's pseudo elements. So pseudo elements are your befores, your afters, your selection, that sort of thing. Something where that didn't exist until you added that style. Does that make sense? Great. So, selector importance. In order, we have inline styles are the most important. IDs, second most important. Classes, along with the pseudo variants, or pseudo classes, and attributes are the third most important. And then we have elements, along with the pseudo elements, are the least important. So, in this example, .nav, we could see that it's a class, so it will be the third most important. And we can denote it like this. So we've got 0, 0, 1, 0, because it's one of the classes, so we'll stick a 1 in that column. Similarly, it will do the same thing for elements. However, when I was a young boy, when I was just starting, and I was reading about this, I made a very crucial mistake. I thought that this would work, that this top selector would override this bottom one. Because it makes sense, right? You're reading this and you're like, oh, 10. Oh, 11. 11's higher than 10. That's definitely going to be more important. It's not. It's definitely not. We need to look at it similar to how versioning works. We need to put dots in between them. So when you look at it like this, it makes way more sense because the 1.0 is always going to be higher than 0. anything, right? So now that that's out of the way and my shame is gone. This is a similar example. However, we've got a sneaky class at the end there. We've got the .nav, and that will push this selector to be more important than that. So when you've got really long selectors, this is the problem you run into. You have to start counting how important those selectors are, and you don't want to be there. There is an important exception, however. The important rule. Everybody's favorite rule to use, right? We use it in every project. No, didn't think so. So in this scenario, both of them are important. So the cascade's going to take priority, right? However, in this example, what you can see is the importance has actually added another column in this I don't know, importance thing. So because we do now have an element on the end of that top one, that now becomes more important, despite the importance rule. So that's something to be aware of. This is why, as well, by the way, we don't like to use the important rule. It's not just that it's kind of like a nuclear catch-all to try and overwrite anything. It means that, let's say we had an important rule on every single class, on every single rule that we had. It now, I know, nightmare scenario, it now makes it really difficult to actually think about what's going to be applied, because you get then having to follow the cascade very, very carefully and look at all the other things as well. So re-quiz time. That quiz we just took earlier, you should be able to ace it now. So the first question was, we've got a nav element and a nav class, and the color's going to be blue. And then we've got nav div ul li a. Hands up for blue. And hands up for red. Great. All of you are right, I think. It's going to be blue because there's only one element there and there's one class. So we have this class here and we have one element here. Whereas you can have as many elements as you want, but if there's a class there, the class is always going to overwrite it. Next question. We've got a nav, ul, and item class, and then we have a nav class, ul, and a. Hands up for blue. Hands up for red. Interesting. It's going to be red this time, and that is because they're both of. Oh, sorry about this. They're both. I just noticed that. Yeah, they're both going to be. They're both the same importance, which means the cascade takes priority this time. And now we have a nav class, ul, a, and href of equals /. And then we have a nav, .nav, ul, and item class. Hands up for blue. Hands up for red. Correct, it's red this time. Same reason as before. The href attribute is the same importance as a class. So essentially we've got two classes up there and two elements, and we've got two classes on the bottom with two elements. So because they're the same importance, the cascade takes priority. So onto the naming section. Now we understand specificity, we can understand why we name things in a very particular way. And it's usually to try and avoid conflicts with specificity. But first, I need to talk about variable naming because I've got another shaming story. So, out of interest, how many people name their colors like this? Huh, interesting. So I thought everybody did, right? I at some point along the line had convinced myself that this was the correct way to name variables, because I can't even describe why. I just in my heart I felt it was right. And the only reason I could come up to think about why this might not be right, this might be right, is because if the brand color changes, now you have to change all of your variable names, right? Because it wouldn't make sense if you just called it red. But that's not a problem, because most editors have a global find and research and find and search. And finding and searching that one variable across all of your SAS or less files, dead easy. So it makes way more sense to name your variables as what they actually are. This allows you to actually work in your project without having to reference the variable file thinking, what one was the primary color? Anyway, since none of you put your hand up saying you named variables like that, I don't think this applies to any of you. Same thing for this. But what I have been doing is I've been using, instead of doing like red light, red lighter, red dark, red darker, I've usually those different colors are some mix of white or opacity. So I've been using these SAS functions and then calling the variables red 50 for if it's 50% lighter, or red 150 if it's 50% darker. And that's been working really, really well for me. So talking about BEM now, who uses BEM? Okay, great. So quick introduction about what BEM is. It stands for Block Element Modifier. So the general principle is that you would have, typically in most of your CSS will be one class of importance each. And instead of doing .photo then image to try and select an image in this example, you would do .photo __ image to denote that the photo is the block that you're trying to style, and then the __ image is the element of that block that you're trying to style. There's also modifiers and stuff as well, but we don't really need to get into that too much for this example. So do you see why this might be quite good in terms of managing your specificity? Because in the first example, you have to start thinking and counting how important something is to try and overwrite it later. Whereas if you're using something like BEM, or any naming convention really tries to solve these same problems, we now know exactly how specific it is and where we need to put something to overwrite something. Also, don't do this. This is another thing I tried to do when I first found out about BEM and preprocessors. I thought this was an excellent idea. I think I'd read it somewhere. Oh God, I tried it. I tried it when I first started working, actually, like full time, and that came back to bite me like really hard. It was a fairly big project as well, and when you're writing it, this is fine once you're actually in the project and you've got like headspace around it and you understand what's going on. But if you leave it for a week even, and then you come back to this file could be like 100 lines long, and you're having to like remember what that block is, and then what the element is, then what the modifier is within that nested thing. You can't see up the top because your monitor's too small. So it becomes a nightmare. And also, if you want to try and find and just do a global find for a class that you just need to change something on, you no longer can do that with this because they're all separate and split. So another problem I ran into, BEM in examples doesn't necessarily BEM that you use in real life. So this is a really nice example. It looks really clean. You can imagine the CSS for this looking really clean as well. And the HTML, wonderful. But as soon as you start using it in a real project, you find out, oh wait, it needs to be in a grid. So we add Bootstrap, we put them in a grid, and then we find out, oh no, wait, there needs to be a background. So we can't just have our block above that thing, we need to have it around the container as well. So what do? We do profile card __ container. I don't know about that, but we go ahead. And then there needs to be a button as well. So now we've got profile card, all button as an element, part of profile card. It doesn't quite make sense, does it? So yeah, we've got this problem where we have an element outside of its block, and that probably shouldn't happen. That's not a very BEM-y thing to do, right? Yeah, that's a real word, look it up. So we decide, right, let's forego the grid. The grid's what's causing the problems, not BEM, right? So we think, let's use flex. And we're like, right, so now they're flex, but they're not in a container. We do need that container. We could do some weird stuff with like padding and viewport width and stuff, but we're on a tight deadline. We just need to get it done. So we decide to stick in a container. And then we decide, wait, hold on. Once we put that container in, we now need a wrapper inside of that container to get our flex styles to work properly. So we're ending up in the same situation as we did before, where we've got all these weird classes that aren't part of any sort of block. There's just loads of elements everywhere, and now it doesn't make much sense. And our CSS ends up looking something like this. And we've got profile cards, plural. So now the card wrapper and the profile cards card are part of profile cards. So is the image part of cards, or is the image part of profile cards card? And you don't quite know, and it's really complicated and confusing to look at. It'll work, don't get me wrong, it'll be fine, but I wouldn't do it. So here's what I've come up with to try and solve this a little bit. Pulling out of BEM a little bit, I like to camel case my selectors. BEM calls for using hyphens to separate your words. But if you don't use hyphens and use camel case, that means we can use camel case to mean another thing outside of BEM. And this has been working really well for me. So we've got, inside of here, we've got our profile card as it usually is. And then we've got profile card dash container, and we've got profile card dash wrapper. And this is almost exactly the same as the past example, but now because it's outside of this BEM methodology, it makes a little bit more sense, and you can name things a little bit more semantically. And profile card has now become a component that you can use elsewhere, but you can also use it in combination with these little almost helper classes. Honorable mention, CSS. Who's heard of this? No one. Excellent. Oh, I love this. I've been playing around with it, and it's really cool. Haven't really used it in any real projects because to write it nicely, you need to use invalid HTML where you've got -button. I know invalid HTML doesn't really matter. It hasn't mattered for like the last decade. But if that does become used by something in native HTML, then everything will break. So yeah, if you wanted to use it properly, you'd have to prepend it with data. But the idea is with classes, you use the class attribute and add your classes on there. With CSS, that stands for attribute modules, we can create our own attributes that mean something, style those attributes as like base components, and then we can add our own kind of classes inside of those that are specifically scoped to that attribute. And it's really cool and it's really powerful, and I'd recommend that you go to amcss.github.io to have a look about it a little bit more, because it's really interesting. And if we can get past it being invalid HTML, I think it's a really good way to write CSS. Thank you for listening to me ramble on for a little bit and stumble around, and I hope at least some of you learned something.